Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the Sunny's Book Club Zoom discussion, the first and maybe only of its kind, but we got three great people here with us today to discuss the August pick, which was Death by Landscape by Elvia Wilk. This is a collection of essays that was put out by Soft Skull. Elvia Wilk previously published another book with Soft Skull, which was a piece of like climate fiction called Oval, which I really liked, which made me want to pick up this book. And it is hefty and brainy and full of many different topics and talking points that we can discuss. Maybe I'm just going to read the back of the blurb, and I was thinking we could structure this discussion by the three parts. So plants, planets, and then blooded, I think, on the last. So with that little preamble, let me read the blurb on the back and we can get into it. From the acclaimed author of the novel Oval comes a book of fan nonfiction about living and writing in the age of extinction. In this constellation of essays, Elvia Wilk asks what kinds of narratives will help us rethink our human perspective towards Earth. The book begins as an exploration of the role of fiction today and becomes a deep integration of the writing process and the self. Wilk examines creative works across time and genre in order to break down binaries between dystopia and utopia, real and imagined, self and world. She makes connections between works by such wide-ranging writers as Mark Fisher, Karen Russell, Han Kang, Doris Lessing, Anne Carson, Octavia E. Butler, Michelle T., Helen Phillips, Kathy Koja, Jeff and Anne Vandermeer, and Hildegard von Bingen. What happens when research becomes personal, when the observer breaks through the glass? Through the eye of the fan, this collection delves into literal and literary world-building projects, medieval monasteries, solar punk futures, vampire roleplays, environments devoid of humans, bridging the micro and the macro, and revealing how our relationship to narrative shapes our relationships to the natural world and to one another. It's doing a lot. I think it pays off on all of those things. Yeah, like I said, the first section of this book is titled Plants, and it contains maybe like 3 or 4 of the initial essays, and I'd like to open it up there. Would love to know what you got out of Plants specifically.
I will say this was a section where I wasn't sure what I was thinking about the essays, because it is very referential to all of the sort of people that it's referenced on the blurb, the other sort of works of fiction. And luckily I had read some of those before. So I was like, okay, I can see where she's saying something that's maybe different than what I thought, or, I wish I had a book club on that book to unpack a lot of the things that she's talking through. But I was like, is this going to be very academic? But she tees up early that as you move through the collection, it's going to become more and more personal, more and more embedded in the real world instead of fiction. But I think it gave a really great sort of like landscape view of what's happening in fiction right now.
Yeah, one of the things that really sticks out to me about the first section is like the concept of kind of a split existence or the second body. And I think that's when I was like, okay, you got me, right? Because like there's this sort of mind fuck happening around existing in the world right now, and sort of thinking about like what's within the sphere of like my own consciousness, and then what is like how do I try and make sense of all these other things that are happening that I'm like sort of connected to, like cosmically, or like in the way that plants are connected to, but like have less traditional modes of understanding. So I don't know. I think if you're like a reader or a book lover, right, like the opening essay like really brings you in, because it's able to sort of both enjoy so many different types of work, but also like really think about it in ways that you might not have considered, whether that's crossing sort of genres or time or things like that. So I think it's a really ambitious kind of opening, but I think being able to then center the individual in it and even say, hey, it's hard for any human to kind of like be existing in this time, you're like, okay, yes, that resonates with me. So that's what I really got out of the first section.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that split duality that you just talked about, especially in this time period where like the world is massively globalized, like globalization is in full effect. And in theory, you would think that makes us feel more connected to people and like more in touch with this eternal thread of humanity to like protect one another. But it's actually just done the complete opposite, where it's made people who are far away and experiencing like all of these different global tragedies, specifically around climate, I guess, which is like a big red thread in this book. It makes it feel othered or like farther away from you, even though we're more connected and have more access to each other than ever. It's interesting to see that like psychological split, even though we have more modes of communion than ever before. I was also like really focused on this section about how it's just like a defense of genre fiction and genre writing. And as someone who like very plainly professes that I mostly read literary fiction, and there's a lot of political backing around the divide there, and like, you know, there's a historical precedence to have an argument on either side of that that aisle, kind of, if we're gonna use political language that way. I thought that was really interesting and valuable, and like centering this concept of the weird and how genre fiction actually does that the most effectively and can provide and push on people's perspectives and like offer new solutions, whether they're good or bad. It's just something different. I found really valuable and fun to read about, that she was just like so pro science fiction specifically, you know what I mean?
And
Yeah.
I thought it was, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, please go ahead, Deb.
I was going to say, in talking about genre fiction and sci-fi in particular, there's also the argument of like, is there a responsibility to provide solutions, and what does that, like, there are so many sort of like layered arguments that she's exploring here of like, number one, don't just box genre fiction in a corner, and then also in that box don't have like heightened moral expectations on these authors to paint a future. They're, you know, just as any writer should and can do, is like interrogate the now, just put what's happening in front of us in a new light and let people take what they want from it. Like, it shouldn't be on writers necessarily to force the future.
Yeah, I'm reading a line right now and it says, the fiction that takes climate change seriously has not been taken seriously as fiction. That's just like the best summation of that kind of stance in the broader literary world. And her specific sci-fi and like fantasy references, it's like a lot of Vandermeer in here, which I've never read, but her exploring, I guess, specifically these concepts of like nature overtaking, or like pervasive nature, like taking back the land, and kind of offering a non-romantic view to that. Because I feel like there's even like memes and like stuff in pop culture where it's like, you know, Earth with no humans and it's like flowing with like trees, and I'm like, no, the destruction's still going to be there. Like, nature also has an agenda, and her like talking about it like a sentient thing, because it is hyper connected and systemic and moves as a system and thinks and works as a system, was interesting to me and made me want to read Vandermeer. Have you guys read Vandermeer?
Yeah, I've read Annihilation.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that like she made me also look at his work in a new light, but I feel the same way about this sort of defense of genre fiction, but I'm still like, I don't particularly enjoy it. And while I might like go back to Annihilation, I can see where there are some areas where he was being really like innovative or radical. I'm still kind of in this place of I can appreciate the ideas much more than how it works for me, like artistically or like
Yeah,
on like a narrative level. So yeah, that's something that I'm kind of navigating, I guess, when she's sort of looking back at a lot of work that I maybe was exposed to or read, but like didn't love.
totally. I'm like, oh, I probably like your philosophical takedown of like what he's doing in that more than I would the reading experience, which is something weird to work through. Exactly what you just said. Loved the Atessa section. The death in her hands. I never thought of it as an environmental attack, the character's death in that novel. And I was like, whoa, like that's another one where it shined a light on a new way of viewing that entire narrative. Overall, I thought this was immediately when I finished the book, which to be totally candid was last night. I was like, ooh, I wonder if I think the first section was my favorite because it's what I thought was going to happen going into it. But now that I'm 8 hours away from, great sinking in of me finishing this last night and thinking about the other topics and like things we can parse out in the coming two sections, I'm like, maybe this was my least favorite, which is interesting. I don't know why.
When I was reading it, I was like, I know this is necessary, but I am eager for what she's going to do next with this setup. Because they are all interconnected essays. They, take an element of the one before, and it is very organic and gross. So I just knew that the first section really was a foundation into the rest.
Yeah, I think it's like that distance, right? We're like very academic, very examining things and like looking at systematic fiction from that kind of like cold lens. So maybe in retrospect, I liked when we got to be a little bit more personal to her. Anything else we want to talk about with planets before we, plants before we move to planets?
Christine, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was wondering if anyone had thoughts on the idea of like compost and what she was discussing. I think it was still this section. When she started talking about gift giving, I thought that was kind of an exciting idea. I was I don't even know what the word is. The section titled Anal Utopia.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was just so interesting and exciting in a way that was unique from probably anything I've ever read. But yeah, this idea of like nothing goes away, like it comes back. Yeah, so I was just wondering if anyone had thoughts there. Or maybe not.
Yeah, I was right. I was scanning through my book right at Utopia, right when you pointed it out, and that was a section where I was like, wrote a note to myself: is this a tie dash joke? Like she was doing like really clever things in there, and like it is self-aware and that it's doing something bold. But yeah, the idea it connected with her talking about compost and the idea that like our organic bodies beget other organisms and like we're all connected. And that's an idea that I've always thought about and resonated with, but this is like a very intense way to look at it because it's very human focused and risque maybe in sort of the framing.
Yeah, I like that you point out just kind of like how clever she is in that one, because as I was reading this, I was like, I think she's like funny. The book is funny in a lot of ways that I just didn't expect, and I think she's a little like almost like cheeky, like it's a little funny with an attitude to me. But yeah,
for sure, she's like LARPing literary criticism also. I mean, one of the things I had to sort of refresh my memory of that section, but I think it's interesting how she sort of juxtaposes like reproductive labor in the ways of artistic creation with sort of like the traditional roles of creating family, and sort of talking about how while like both of those situations have to exist under capitalism, there's like ways that they can be subverted, whether that's through surrogacy or different sorts of like family by choice, or it is about how like an artist like conceives of their work in the world or something. And so it's kind of a short section. I don't know if she's like completely like went there, but she definitely like gave enough to be like, oh, there's like some more things I could think about or read about that are being posited here. Not the least of which being anal sex, right? I was like, okay, I could like think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's like the first dip into this book, and I think it shows up in other places of like eroticism within the natural world and how the personal interties with that. And I think as the sections get more personal, we can kind of see more glimpses of that. Yeah, agree. Kind of just like a shocking section, I think, because of its length and where it was situated in this book, and because there's so many rich ideas there that she could have definitely explored further, but weird and stuck out to all of us, and we remember it, so it's working. All right, we're going to planets. Are we ready? We're ready. Let me see my notes for planets. Okay, so my summary of this section was all of the essays are kind of talking about the role art plays in the Anthropocene and ways of bringing up the weird. And it's kind of the more depressive, solitary, I guess, pessimistic glance at climate futures and the climate crisis and how that feels on a deeply personal level and manifests itself like in ways of depression and this idea of the void and black holes. And it just felt like very dark with different thematic imagery that felt like a big black hole, right? And all of those kind of more depressive thoughts that you can lean into when you don't feel interconnected to a plant system and you do feel just like a planet in an orbit, alone and isolated.
Yeah, I had the hardest time with the middle section actually. And I don't know, I think partly it despite my background, I don't love space. I find it very alienating and I find it kind of like dislocating from, you know, being present in the world that we inhabit, right? And I like think about all the time like, oh, is space really our future or salvation, or is it just like this big circle jerk that we're all like pouring money into? But I relate to what you said, CJ, about like it is a bit isolating and I couldn't access the ideas as well, like even some of the literary, like the books that they reference and, you know, virtual reality and some of these other things. I'm just like, I don't know, I'm not as interested in, or I find it a bit more like cold, I guess. And so I don't really know what I took away other than this need to continue to push the boundaries of like the concept of the self and about like I was interested in solar punk, like I hadn't really heard about it, and I've heard of, you know, like things like degrowth and, you know, anti-capitalist things, and like how can we imagine a future that is attainable, that is like more livable. I was like very intrigued by like sort of the breadcrumbs she put in there, but I didn't particularly like latch on to any of the essays in this section.
I think this is my favorite section. And I don't know why that is. I think it just hit on the isolated, ugly thoughts you have about your real, true pessimistic, my real, true pessimistic leans that I think about when I'm faced with the future, and like really summarizing that hopelessness and connecting it back to these bigger metaphors to describe them that were like really beautiful to me and like kind of paranoid and just kind of anxiety ridden. I really liked the tech overture. all of that was really interesting to me, and just thinking about like different ways that, is this a section? Oh no, I guess the VR gaming stuff is in Bleed. But regardless, I think just like the desire to end life as we know it because you can't picture a future is like not a fun thing to entertain, but it is a place my brain goes to. So I was like, thank you for saying that out loud. That's kind of how I felt about it.
Yeah, similar vibes there as well. It's like that, it's intense, but I think a lot of us think about this. Another piece of this section is exploring like utopia versus dystopia in sort of reality and how we imagine futures, like our actual future, and also in fiction. But one of the notes that I had was like, does the general public think of utopia as good? Or did we all have like the same experience in high school where we're like, utopia is actually like satire and you shouldn't actually want a utopia? Because I've always, not always, but like, you know, through school, like we really looked at what does it mean to be a utopia? Who decides what a utopia is? Is it something that works for everyone, or is it just like it works for the people who are in power now and they're imagining their own future and they'll leave everyone else behind? And I was curious if like other people had a similar experience where they don't dream of a utopia because they know that it's by nature exclusionary.
Mm-hmm.
I was very interested in the same sort of theme within this section. I think it's very interesting to think about access when you think about utopia. I first noted that when she was talking about steampunk in particular, and how it's this idea of like anyone can pick up a tool and make something, but then who like truly has access to these things? Yeah, but they're moving away from the mass produced, and that to me brings up ideas of like limitation, and how can mass production be involved in a utopia? And then it went down this line to like, it's not that hard to imagine dystopia if you are in a group who, you know, suffers from these systematic things currently in place. And likewise, people who can come up with these ideas for a utopia might not be aware of the things actually happening. Yeah, so I also found that like a very interesting and exciting section to read, that I kind of was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's like exciting to hear discussed in this way, in context with nature.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, Grace, based on what you said before, I feel like maybe, tell me if this is a vibe that you got, but like Elon Musk colonizing Mars is like not what you want as our sort of exit plan.
God,
as
no.
humanity.
Please, God, no.
I mean, he can feel free to leave at any time.
Yeah.
That would be great. But yeah, I was thinking about what you posited about utopia and like if that's something we want. And I think what's kind of interesting about this like same time that we're experiencing like massive ecological collapse, we're also seeing such a collapse in like socio-political institution like functioning like at all. And so part of what I think about when I think about utopia now is that it has to be like so many different things like at once. Like there isn't like one idea that's going to save us all, right? Like there's so many interconnected or even totally distinct aspects. And part of it is trying to say that like human beings, like we are like the agents of our own future in a way, but it's also like not up to humans like as a distinct entity in a way. Like there has to be some sort of like interspecies or beyond human sort of cooperation. And so when I think about this idea of utopia, it's like, well, yeah, it's going to be sort of decentralized and disjointed and like a weird time of like massive experimentation because so many different entities or species are experiencing various levels of I don't want to say collapse exactly, but like kind of struggle. And so yeah, that's just what it makes me think about.
I feel like that idea of like temporal looking back or looking, I think is a section called looking sideways. Yeah, looking sideways to other species, other cultures, other time periods, and having that multiplicity and experimentation be driven and not always future based. It's looking kind of in a 360 surround of solutions that maybe were already presented and were left out of, histories for all of the number of reasons that so many things have been left out of histories of the world, are really interesting and optimistic in a weird way, but sound really hard. And I'm wondering how she links that back, I guess, to fiction and to storytelling, like that idea of the 360 and being able to look for solutions anywhere. I think it hits again upon her kind of inclusion of genre fiction into different ways we can perceive and like view the world. But do you guys have any thoughts about that? Like, how else can stories or fiction or reading help us get to a 360 kind of like searching?
I actually think she gets at it in the third part a little bit, and maybe that's
What
where
a
like
transition.
the borders of the sections are a bit porous.
Yeah.
So happy to hold and go to the next part if people have thoughts about.
I'll say the
here.
one thing in this section was there's science fiction into science action, like really talking about that idea. And one of the things that she is sort of recapping here is how like finance capitalism is really speculation. But it made me think of like the tools that they're using to anticipate futures for financial means. It was like really the premise of Westworld season 3. They had an AI that like could predict the future by having all of this data in it. And she talks, I can't pronounce this word, Ouroboros, the reciprocal causal loop between fiction and reality. And so in Westworld, they're sort of exploring like, if you know the path that this machine is predicting for you, will you change or stay the same? Is it accurate? And I think like it's not a direct link to reading, but I think about when we're building the 360, we've already said it before, but like including every story, that the machine that does speculation can only predict based off what it's fed. And if you're missing information from half the population who isn't connected to the internet, isn't inputting data in that way, doesn't want their data collected, like, can you really get that 360 view? And that's like thinking at a systemic societal level, but like reading is literally the input of new ideas into your machine and imagining your own future. So like reading and just practicing broad readership as an individual will help you, but I don't know how to scale that up to a like societal level.
Yeah, it's probably putting too much pressure on literature and its demands and its proposed obligations of an art form, right? Which I think she touches on a little bit, is like the politicization of what literature should do and tell you how to be and how to act and how to think. Interesting. Okay. Love Melancholia. Great movie.
Her writing about it made me want to rewatch it.
Same.
Like, I think I was too young to understand everything that was going on in that movie then. But like looking at it now and respecting it is more of like, then this is just really dark and beautiful art, like what they're really trying to say in it. It definitely made me want to look back. And I think with all of the sort of literature that she's covering, whether it's movies or writing, it makes you want to go back and read it again and think about it in a new way.
Yeah, are there any specifically that came up for you besides Melancholia? I like have a notes app thing where I was just like writing things down. I was like, ooh, sounds good. Sounds good.
And maybe Annihilation. I read Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. I did not see the movie, so maybe the idea of like reading it, watching the movie, seeing how those ideas are explored in a new form is interesting, because like Grace said earlier, the meat of that book, I mean, he's doing interesting things with the writing, but like the ideas that he's putting forth are the most important thing, and having it have it taken another form in an adaptation made me want to look at it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go a little bit deeper into Susan Sontag now. I think I felt too young or like too dumb for her. But now that I have like a bit more years of experience and like the way that she talks about documentary and what gets hidden when we try and exact or extract the truth of something, really made me sort of interested in sort of going back to some of those kind of more seminal texts, I guess, like Against Interpretation and On Illness and stuff like that.
Totally. I went to art school, so I read way too much Sontag, like specifically about image making and photography and those tools as means of violence against people's unwilling bodies. So I loved that section that gets into trauma and just really dissecting and analyzing image making. It's really fascinating to me. I really want to read Black Wave. Sounds sick. I love like a post Los Angeles climate fiction novel. I'm reading another one right now called Gold Famed Citrus by Claire V. Watkins. It's really good so far. I'm really liking it. And then both of the weird books about the black hole sounds so cool.
Yeah. Like
Love.
It's called like Renamed Cipher or something, so like Fun Hole's not
Cipher,
marketable.
Yeah, Fun Hole.
Fun Hole would now be the title.
Totally. I can see the cover. Like I can picture it in my head. Oh man. All right, Bleed. We're into blood, everyone. Do we feel the progression? Do we feel the essay getting more hyper personal and like maybe about the body now? So maybe
Yes.
it's like planet interconnection. Maybe it's actually like psychological. Planet is psychological, and then bleed is like in the body. Maybe that's a good summation.
Yeah, and like throughout, I was circling anytime she referenced herself, and you know, like in the first essays, it's like maybe once right at the end, and then this section leads with, you know, I approach, like it's about her personal experiences. And you started to get that in a section before, to your point CJ, around it being psychological. It was like talking a little bit about herself and not going into detail. She was very conscientious to be like, I'm talking about trauma and how I'm addressing my trauma, but I will not tell you what my trauma is. That's like, you don't need to know. But then we get into like even more personal here in the third section.
I love the takedown of The Body Keeps the Score and just kind of noting that book's cultural cachet, and for good and for worse, her kind of like view of that book and the way it's been interpreted by social media influencers and, you know, everyone pushing their own agenda into it. I don't think I've ever seen articulated before. I've read that book and it unpacked like a lot of things for me. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, that's what it was doing, and that is how it was received. And seeing the positives and negatives of that were really interesting to me. And just this idea of PTSD stored in the body, and then like you can't help but think of the previous sections and like planetary PTSD, and it's like bubbling up as all of these different kinds of climate crisis symptoms, if you will, if we're going to extend the metaphor that far. I really liked the Extinction Burst section. I really liked that essay.
I did not grow up religious, but that section was very interesting to me because it's just like, Catholicism is very mystical and visual, and like it's all storytelling, and maybe it's your quest for meaning, it's all religion is, but she's really like digging into that here, which I did not know that, some of the things she's covering of the wounds of Christ, like being something that people want to be touching physically, and they have like the vellum paper on the books, like just the way people are engaging there. I can't even remember what she was trying to even say there, but just the visuals of like that obsession and search for meaning in a physical way through religion was interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that's a good like sort of subtitle to this section. I mean, there's definitely an emphasis on the corporeal form, but there's also just like how we seek meaning and make meaning in our lives, right? And so I guess your earlier question, CJ, I don't remember it exactly, but it's like, how can like fiction help, or, where are the bounds of fiction, and how does it connect? I think I loved the essays on LARPing. I ate it up because I was like, this is like one, like a subculture that I think is like easily derided, or you're like, oh, geeks, right? And like the way she sort of compares like European LARPers with like sort of US like stereotypical LARPers. But it made me think about like books differently, because she's sort of like, when we're discussing like how she created this role play around her book to see like what the different outcomes might be. And I was like, oh, so interesting, because like I think we have this image of like an author like locked away in their little room, and like blah, everything sort of comes from them, and sort of like breaking down the boundaries of storytelling and like where it comes from, and sort of this like I don't know, sort of like porous membrane of like inspiration and output in a way. I don't know. I just found it fascinating to think about how like human beings are so driven by stories and drawn to them, and how can I think about just like stories more so than books even, and especially in this sort of weird technological age where we're also seeking like, I don't know, like experiences, right, that aren't exactly tangible, but that like light up like similar parts of like our brain or our being or something. And I don't know, I like, as somebody who like isn't necessarily drawn to LARPing and other sorts of like D&D and like all those things, like I can kind of see it like more so now. I was like very intrigued by it because I could see like the power of storytelling there in a way that I think I had kind of like glossed over before.
Yeah, her like interrogation of single authorship and novels should be able to have that multiverse experience of a creator coming back to it and making it new, and her showing how that like versioning, I guess, and how that exists in almost every other medium except for literature, and her tying it back to like the Industrial Revolution and books as objects. I was like, whoa. That opened up so many things for me, and I think really just blew open the idea of interpretation and the way, even like what you just said about the ways we seek other people's interpretations about the things we just interpreted. I'm like, I read a book, I have to go look up a reviewer I trust who can tell me how to feel about it, or if I'm like stuck, I need to have a conversation about it. It's just, those things do happen, but I feel like we don't revisit the text for them to happen. Makes me think about rereading. Maybe I should reread things more. Maybe that's like the one tangible and accessible way for that to happen, without the influence of other people, maybe.
Yeah, I don't reread often, but I really enjoyed John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, which is like supposed to be a travelogue memoir, but maybe fictional, him traveling across the country with his dog. and I read it in high school, and then I read it again after college, and just seeing where I had highlighted things, and just like, you are now in conversation with yourself as much as you are in conversation with the text. And I think that helps you clarify without, well, I was gonna say without talking to somebody else, but really you are a different person than you were before. I think one of the last essays is mentions, I can't remember the reference story, but like the unknown woman following the unknown woman, and like just trying to figure out who you are and if you're different. Like that's also, I think, the experience of rereading.
I loved the EMDR situated in the passage that's also talking about religion and like mysticism, and her just being kind of dumbfounded as well. But I'm like, how does literally recarving neural pathways in our brain work by something so seemingly like rudimentary, like touch and moving your eyes? So fascinating to me. I was like, ooh, I want an EMDR experience immediately. That would be so interesting to have gone through that. And I also liked her kind of showcasing it in the context of disassociation, and how it wasn't maybe like a full-on solution, but it gave her like a stepping point to be able to access that space or not. That just felt really honest to me. You know what I mean? She's like, sometimes I need to get outside of my body and float above it for a second to be able to escape a thing. And I was like, hell yeah. That's cool that you found a provider who like understood that and offered you something that can let you access that a little bit more easily.
What do you think? I'm going back to the LARPing essay again, but just about this idea of explicitly creating a social contract in interactions, and like where you think like we've lost the social contract, like where we need things to be more explicit. Like I was just thinking and about like some of those things, like small things, like having lunch together would like reduce violence in like a fictional world, because you're like, oh, you're not just like an imaginary being. I don't know. I was just like, I'm still thinking about where I feel like we don't have a social contract anymore, like kind of on a macro level, and then where I think I need to have it and sort of with my own personal relationships.
Yeah, I liked her using the context of like gaming and like game structure as a way for people to opt in or learn different intimacies with one another that are kind of like outside the prescribed social boundaries, but also can reinforce them negatively at the same time. I like that she acknowledged that. That didn't answer your question, but I don't know. And I think she opened up like a great can of worms of thinking about that kind of, can we call it consent culture? What did you call it?
I don't know, social contract negotiation
Yes.
or something. I think
Yeah.
consent culture is also apt, or at least a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this idea that you can be transgressive, or you could do things that you wouldn't necessarily imagine from the get-go, but it is all within this frame of like we both want a certain type of experience. I don't know. And maybe that desire feels even like strengthened, because I feel like the outside world is so unexpected or like unpredictable in some ways. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, what are the game mechanics of any type of cultural production? So interesting. I loved using that framework to think about the exact questions you're bringing up.
In college, I had an experience where I went to Washington, D.C. I happened to be with a group that got to go to the CIA, and we did, it's very strange. But our activity while we were there was it was like, it's basically a LARP, right? And she talks about it in here, like there are military exercises that are run as games. And so we were all given like a name tag with our role and our little paper. I didn't think of it as LARPing then, but we were literally LARPing being in the CIA. And I think that's like crazy, because it's just
Evil.
the evil side of that. But I think about when you go to work anywhere, like, are you like, you have a role, you have a title, like, what if we at work like had conversation around what we're doing? I work at a media company, so like, what to her bigger message around like the art that we're making and the culture that we're making and all of that, like, what does that do with people? Like, we should really think about it seriously. And I don't think we get the chance to like pause and examine what our roles are, and if are we doing what we think our player role would want versus, or like our character. That's actually separation. Your character in the game, and then you are a player outside of the game. So like, are we doing what we think our character should do instead of what we actually want as the player? It's like, we need to unpack this in therapy.
I think we're LARPing all the time.
Yeah.
Like I'm LARPing as a manager and what I think a manager should do, or I'm LARPing as like a customer and trying to be a good customer, or like LARPing a middle class, like educated bi-coastal elite, or like whatever like any of those things mean, right? Or even inside, like in the more domestic sphere, like with relationships, I don't know, I've talked with like other friends who are like, I'm looking for different models in my relationships with my partner, but like I still find myself falling into these like gendered traps. Like, how is this happening? So I don't know, it's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's where like gamification can either reinforce or offer something new, and that's why it's dangerous, right? It's like both of those sides of those coins exist, and compartmentalizing yourself into those different roles that you have to play or want to play or hope to play in the future leads to a sense of like disembodiment. And I think it harkens back to kind of what she was talking about with disassociation and like wanting to be outside of herself in an interesting way that I haven't really fully formulated my thoughts about. But like her inclination to like get freedom and feel something overall net positive out of her LARPing experience, right? It probably has something to do with being outside of yourself and like getting access away from whatever the self is.
But then I agree with you, CJ, but then weirdly, the book, like the epilogue portion, gets very closed. And, obviously that's like the effect of the time scale and the pandemic, right? But it's like she is in it and she's like doing her yoga in one side of the room, and then she's like eating her food. Like it's very closed in and very much about you moving through kind of a constrained space and like being present, I guess, for those.
And I guess that's probably because there's none of those structures to have her LARP anymore. She's just herself. She's not in situations where she's LARPing. She's just alone in her house.
And I think the context of like, she's talking about the pandemic, her experience in quarantine here, and explores the documentary Spaceship Earth, and then the idea of the biosphere. During the pandemic, there was a YouTube creator who did his own sort of take on this called Spaceship U, and it was taking the idea of like, the biosphere is now your house, and like, how are you going to survive now in the quarantine? And like, this was like looking at her exploring Spaceship U herself, that last section of the Queen of Reps, like, how do I cope when I am divorced from everything I had before to put purpose on my life, or like pretend that I had more balance than I thought I did, or I was coping well with the world. It got very claustrophobic, like from the idea of plants to planets to bleed, like, and bleed, that section was the bleeding between technology, personhood, story, and then you get like zoomed right in at the very end on her experience. This book was ambitious. These essays are ambitious, and I think they were fruitful in that exploration.
Agree. I really enjoyed my time with it. It was weird and brainy and gave me a lot of new things or ways to look at things, which is all we can hope, right? Have any of y'all read Oval, her other book?
I have it out from the library right now.
Cool. You should read it.
CJ, does Erica, who just joined, have thoughts? Or
Hi, Erica.
Hi. No thoughts. I haven't read it yet. I have it as the same. So I just wanted to join because I've been a long time follower of CJ. Hey, CJ.
Hi, Erica.
I just wanted to hop on and kind of, I guess I would have had FOMO otherwise.
Love it. Well, we're just wrapping up, Erica, but the discussion will be on my YouTube later to watch in full.
Okay, I will tune in.
Awesome.
I have
Anything
a final
else?
question.
Yes.
Would you recommend this to anyone or like a certain type of reader?
Oh, definitely a certain type of reader. Absolutely. Who that reader is? I don't know. Who would you say they are?
I think if you liked No One Is Talking About This, you will like this book. It's like there's something like indefinable, right? Like, what is this, right? That we're like all grappling with.
Yes.
It's like a nonfiction equivalent of that. I mean, I think it's a little bit different in scope and like, but that would be a reader I would recommend if you like that book.
Yeah, like something with an experimental bent, something that is like really self-questioning and ripping apart the text as it's making it in real time.
Mhm.
I think No One's Talking About This is a great example of that. Maybe Fake Accounts too. I think that does it in a more traditional, linear,
Mhm.
novelistic way, but does have that bent to it in the same time as me, I think.
Well, thanks for hosting.
Yeah, thank you
Enjoyed.
guys for coming. Our first book club. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Be well.
Bye.